All right. Ready to dive deep into universal basic income.
UBI, right.
Yeah, UBI. We're going deep on this one, exploring all the details and hopefully uncovering some interesting insights. You gave us a ton of research, case studies, and examples of how UBI has been tried around the world.
It's amazing how much there is on this topic.
It is. So let's jump right in.
One thing that really struck me is that UBI isn't some new futuristic concept.
Right, like flying cars and robot butlers.
Exactly. It's actually been around for centuries.
Yeah.
And it's gaining more and more attention, especially as we grapple with AI and automation.
You mentioned you were really interested in how UBI has been tested in real life. There were some historical experiments, right, back in the 1970s in the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, those early programs like the Minkum experiment in Canada are super valuable. They give us real data on how UBI can affect things like work habits and social outcomes. But the idea goes even further back.
Further back, like horse and buggy days.
Well, not quite that far.
Yeah.
But remember Milton Friedman, the famous economist? He proposed a negative income tax back in the 1960s. That's basically a form of UBI.
Interesting. So we've got these early North American experiments, but you also had that article about a child benefit program in Mongolia in the 2000s. What can we learn from that?
The Mongolian case is fascinating. It shows how a UBI-like program, even one just for kids, can really impact poverty and decisions about work. They found that even though the benefit was a relatively small amount, it had a big impact on families, especially in rural areas and families with more children.
Makes you think how a similar program might play out in different cultures. Speaking of different places, Alaska has something kind of like a mini UBI.
Right, the Alaska Permanent Fund. It uses oil money to give every resident a yearly payment. It's not a pure UBI because the amount changes each year, but it's a real-world example of how a resource could be used to fund something like a UBI.
That's pretty clever, using oil revenue like that. And then there's the Cherokee Nation using casino profits to distribute to members. Seems like there are lots of creative ways to approach this.
Definitely. The Cherokee Nation shows how alternative revenue streams, like those from specific industries, can finance UBI-style programs.
Okay, so we're seeing there are different ways this could work. But let's talk about the big question, the one everyone asks. Does giving people free money make them lazy? I know you pulled some research papers on that.
It's a common concern, and it's important to look at the evidence. Lots of studies, including that Minkum experiment we talked about, suggest that UBI doesn't lead to everyone becoming lazy. In fact, some research suggests it might even get more people working, particularly those who were previously unemployed or underemployed.
That's surprising, isn't it? And it seems like that Minkum experiment in Dauphin, Manitoba showed some other interesting effects too, beyond just employment, something about health and social outcomes.
Yeah, the findings from Dauphin are really interesting. The study showed a decrease in hospital visits, especially for things like mental health issues and accidents. That suggests the financial security from UBI could reduce stress and improve overall well-being.
So it's not just about the money, it's about the ripple effects on people's lives. But let's be honest, the big question is, how do we pay for this?
The million-dollar question, right? Our sources talk about a few possible funding models, each with its own pros and cons. There's the negative income tax, consumption taxes, taxing big tech, and even taxing financial transactions. Finding a sustainable funding solution is key. And the debate about how to fund UBI is just as complex as the debate about UBI itself.
It really is. And talking about real-world stuff, you found that article on Spain's minimum income scheme from 2020. How's that going?
Spain's a good example of a recent attempt at a UBI-like program. Still early days, but early assessments suggest it's working well for vulnerable populations, those who might have been missed by traditional welfare systems.
So, promising, but it's too early to say for sure. All right, let's get to the heart of this. You were really curious about the main arguments for and against UBI. Let's break those down.
For UBI, people argue that it could be a powerful way to reduce poverty and inequality. They see it as a way to boost economic security, give people more freedom, and promote social justice.
Sounds pretty positive. What about the other side? What do people who oppose UBI say?
They often worry about the economic impact. Things like inflation, people being less motivated to work leading to labor shortages, and the risk of people becoming too reliant on government help. They also question whether it's affordable in the long run and whether it might stifle innovation.
So it seems like a lot hinges on how UBI might change people's work ethic and the overall economy. But before we wrap up, we need to look at some specific examples of how UBI has been implemented and studied worldwide. For a more complete picture, Did you know that Iran actually tried a nationwide UBI program?
Yeah, in 2010, they replaced energy subsidies with a universal cash transfer program, basically a temporary UBI for the whole country. They used existing government funds, which was interesting, but a mix of economic and political issues stopped it from continuing past the initial phase.
Wow, a nationwide UBI. That must have been a huge undertaking. And you also included something about a UBI experiment happening right now in Kenya.
The Kenya experiment started in 2018. It's a long-term study to see how UBI works in a developing country. What's cool is they're trying different ways to deliver the money, like a one-time payment and regular monthly payments. It'll help us understand how to implement UBI effectively in different situations.
That makes sense. It's not just about whether it works, but how it works and for whom. You also had that article about lab experiments and simulations to study UBI. What's that about?
Those are really controlled ways to test specific ideas about how UBI affects individuals and the economy as a whole. For example, they've looked at how UBI changes people's willingness to take risks or their effort in work-related tasks. Simulations can model the big picture effects like GDP, employment, and inflation.
Fascinating. I've noticed a recurring theme in all this research is that UBI could help with the challenges of automation. It seems that's a big part of why UBI is getting so much attention now.
Absolutely. As automation and AI change the job market, some experts see UBI as a safety net for workers who lose their jobs to technology. It's a way to make sure everyone benefits from these advancements, not just those who own or control the tech.
And it's not just about preventing job losses. Some argue that UBI could give people the freedom to be creative, start businesses, or invest in education, which could lead to economic growth and innovation.
Right, that's a key argument for UBI. The idea is that a basic level of financial security could foster a more entrepreneurial and innovative society. People could take risks and pursue their passions without the constant fear of financial ruin.
That's a hopeful perspective, but we also need to consider the counter-arguments. Some worry that UBI could discourage people from working altogether, leading to labor shortages and economic stagnation.
There's also the concern about unintended consequences. Some economists think UBI could cause inflation if there's more demand for goods and services than supply. Others worry that it could worsen inequality if businesses raise prices in response to people having more money to spend. It's a really complex issue with many possible ripple effects.
So we need to be careful and weigh the potential benefits against the risks. I think it's time to dive deeper into the research on how UBI has actually worked in the real world. You found that study by Bastogli et al.? That seemed pretty comprehensive.
Oh yeah, that one's a great example of the kind of rigorous research being done on UBI. They reviewed a ton of cash transfer programs from 2000 to 2015, like 56 programs across 30 countries. Their findings were interesting. A lot of the studies actually showed positive effects on people participating in the workforce and the number of hours worked.
So that suggests that, at least in some cases, UBI could actually lead to more people working. But what about the studies that did find negative impacts on employment?
That's a good question. It shows we need to look at this very carefully. The studies that found negative impacts often focused on specific groups like child labor, the elderly, caregivers, and people with disabilities. This raises important questions about how UBI might affect different groups differently and whether there might be unintended consequences that need to be addressed.
It's like we need to design UBI in a way that benefits everyone and doesn't unintentionally harm certain groups. Speaking of unintended consequences, your research also talked about the broader social and psychological effects of UBI. What are some of the key findings there?
There's a growing body of evidence suggesting that UBI could be good for mental health. Reducing financial stress and increasing feelings of security and autonomy might lead to fewer mental health problems. It could also strengthen social connections because people would have more time for community involvement and caregiving.
Those are interesting points. It seems like UBI could have a big impact on society as a whole, not just the economy. I remember that study by Petch that looks specifically at UBI and worker motivation.
Yeah, that one was about something called intrinsic motivation. It's basically the drive to do something because it's personally rewarding, not just for external rewards like money. Petch's research suggests that UBI might lead people away from bad jobs, low pay, poor conditions, and toward good jobs that offer more satisfaction and meaning.
So it's not just about how many people work, but the quality of the work they're doing. That's important to remember. But we've skirted around this long enough. Funding. How do we pay for all of this?
Right. Funding is one of the biggest challenges, and the research talks about how complex this issue is. We need to find innovative and sustainable sources of revenue. Some of the ideas they're exploring include taxing automation, implementing land value taxes, and even using carbon taxes to raise money.
Interesting options. But I imagine each has its own set of hurdles and compromises, right? It doesn't seem like there's an easy answer here.
No easy answer at all. The key takeaway is that any UBI funding model will involve tough choices, and we need to think carefully about how it might impact the economy and society. What works in one country might not work somewhere else. Each region is unique, and that needs to be part of the conversation when designing and implementing a UBI program.
And to do it well, we need input from all sorts of experts, right? It's not just an economic issue. It needs economists, policymakers, social scientists, and even everyday people to work together.
Absolutely. This deep dive really highlights the need for a multidisciplinary approach to UBI. We need to think about the economic, social, ethical, and political implications to make sure it benefits everyone.
All right, so we've covered a lot. The history of UBI, real-world examples, busted some myths, and even explored economic modeling. But I still feel like we're circling the core question. Is UBI a good idea?
That's the big one, isn't it? And honestly, there isn't an easy answer. The research shows mixed and sometimes contradictory evidence. What works somewhere might fail somewhere else. What someone sees as good, another sees as bad.
So where does that leave us? It's starting to feel less like an economics debate and more like a philosophy debate.
I think you're right. UBI isn't just about numbers and data. It makes us think about the nature of work, our responsibilities to each other, and what we owe each other as a society. It challenges traditional ideas about welfare and economic security. It makes us rethink how we could create a fairer and more equitable world.
So UBI isn't just about giving people money. It's about starting a deeper conversation about our values and priorities as a society.
Exactly. It's about exploring alternative ways to structure our economies and make sure everyone has a chance to thrive, no matter how quickly technology and society are changing around us.
And those changes, especially with AI and automation, aren't slowing down anytime soon. Some even say that traditional jobs, as we know them, might become scarce in the future.
That's why UBI is getting so much attention. Some see it as a solution to the challenges of a future where work might not be the central focus of our lives. It raises some big questions. What will we do with our time? How will we support ourselves? What will give our lives meaning and purpose?
Wow, those are big questions. It seems like UBI forces us to think about the future of work and the very nature of human existence.
One of the sources you gave us actually called UBI a societal experiment. It asks, what would happen if everyone had a basic level of financial security? How would it change our behaviors, our relationships, our communities, our sense of self?
It's like a social science fiction thought experiment, but it's actually being considered seriously by policymakers around the world.
Exactly. That's what makes UBI so fascinating. It blurs the lines between a theory and a potential real-world solution. It encourages us to think creatively, imagine new possibilities, and have a critical conversation about the future we want.
All right, we've covered a lot, but I want to leave our listeners with something they can take away. What's the most important thing to remember about all of this?
The most important thing is that UBI isn't a simple yes or no question. It's complex, with potential benefits and risks that need to be carefully considered. It's not about blindly supporting or opposing UBI. It's about understanding the complexities, asking tough questions, and forming an informed opinion.
That makes sense. But how can our listeners approach this thoughtfully and productively? What can they do?
Here are a few things to consider. First, what are the biggest challenges facing their community or country? Could UBI help with those challenges? Second, what are the potential good and bad impacts of UBI, both economically and socially? Think about the possible trade-offs. Third, what values and priorities should guide our decisions about UBI? What kind of society do we want? And finally, how can they get involved in the conversation and help shape the future of this debate?
Those are great suggestions. It's about being informed, thinking critically, and actively participating in the discussion.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. Seek out different perspectives. Read about UBI experiments and pilot programs happening globally. The more we know, the better decisions we can make about UBI.
And remember, we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more information out there for anyone who wants to learn more.
Absolutely. And I'd also encourage your listeners to think about the ethical side of UBI. What does it mean to live in a society where everyone is guaranteed a basic income? What does that mean for individual freedom and responsibility? How might UBI change social cohesion and our sense of shared purpose?
Those are some really thought-provoking questions. It shows how UBI goes beyond just economics. It touches on some fundamental philosophical and ethical principles.
You're right. At its core, UBI is about how we choose to live together and how we create a society that's fair, just, and sustainable for everyone. Seeing all these real-world examples and pilot programs really drives home the point that UBI isn't just some abstract idea. People are actually trying this out all over the world.
It is really interesting to see how different countries are approaching it too, given their own unique situations and challenges.
And that's where those simulations and microsimulations you mentioned come in. They're really helpful for understanding the potential ripple effects of UBI on a larger scale.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit. We have listeners who love to geek out on the details, but we also have listeners who just want the big picture.
Gotcha. Well, let's start with Australia. Researchers there use microsimulation techniques to see how a UBI program might affect income distribution and work incentives. What they found is that while UBI could reduce income inequality, it might also lead to a small decrease in the overall number of people working.
Interesting. So less inequality, but maybe a slight dip in employment. What about other parts of the world? What are the simulations showing?
Well, Germany was the focus of a really in-depth microsimulation study. They looked at a negative income tax, which, as we discussed earlier, is a type of UBI. Their model analyzed how it would affect different types of households and genders. The results were pretty interesting. They found both increases and decreases in labor supply depending on individual circumstances.
So it's not as simple as saying, okay, everyone's going to work less if we give them UBI. It seems like the impact on work is way more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And the German study really shows how important it is to consider how different people and families might react to UBI. We can't make one-size-fits-all predictions.
It definitely sounds like we need to avoid making sweeping generalizations. You also had some information about simulations done for Italy and the UK. What did those studies show?
Those studies basically lined up with the findings from Australia and Germany. They showed a mix of impacts on how much people worked, and a lot depended on individual characteristics and the specific design of the UBI program. It really emphasizes that the context matters.
Right. It seems like a recurring theme is that the effects of UBI are really dependent on the specific situation of each country or region.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these simulations so helpful. They don't give us definitive answers, but they help us to understand the potential complexities, and they help us to ask the right questions.
Okay, so we've talked about the history of UBI, we've looked at real-world examples, debunked some myths, and we've even waded into the world of economic modeling. But I feel like we keep coming back to that central question: is UBI a good idea?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the truth is, there's no easy answer. As we've seen, the research is mixed, and sometimes it even contradicts itself. What might work in one place could fail miserably in another. What one person sees as a benefit, another might see as a negative.
So where does that leave us? It almost feels like we've moved beyond an economics debate into a philosophical debate.
I think you're onto something there. UBI isn't just about numbers and data. It forces us to really think about some big questions, like what is the nature of work? What are our social responsibilities? What do we owe each other as members of society? It challenges our existing ideas about things like welfare and economic security. It pushes us to reimagine how we might create a more just and equitable world.
So it's not just about giving people money, it's about starting a conversation about our values and what's important to us as a society.
Exactly. It's about looking at new ways to structure our economies and make sure that everyone has the chance to succeed, no matter how fast technology or society is changing around us.
And we know those changes, especially with AI and automation, are moving quickly. Some experts are even saying that traditional jobs, the jobs we're used to, might become much less common in the future.
That's a big reason why there's so much interest in UBI right now. Some see it as a potential solution to a future where work might not be the main focus of our lives. It makes us ask some tough questions. What will we do with our time if that happens? How will we support ourselves? What will give our lives meaning?
Wow, those are some heavy questions. It feels like UBI is making us confront some really big issues about the future of work, maybe even about what it means to be human.
One of those sources you gave me actually called UBI a societal experiment. It poses this really fascinating question. What would happen if everyone, just by existing, had a basic level of financial security? How would that change how we behave, how we relate to each other, how our communities function, how we see ourselves?
It's like a thought experiment, something out of science fiction, but policymakers around the world are seriously considering it.
I know, right? That's what makes this whole topic so intriguing. It blurs the lines between an abstract idea and a potential solution in the real world. It encourages us to think outside the box, imagine new possibilities, and really engage in a critical discussion about the future we want to create.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to make sure that our listeners come away from this with something concrete. What's the most important thing for them to remember about all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that UBI isn't a simple yes or no question. It's a complex idea with both potential upsides and potential downsides that need careful consideration. It's not about blindly being for or against UBI. It's about understanding the complexities, thinking critically, and forming your own informed opinion.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can our listeners approach this issue in a thoughtful, productive way? What are some concrete steps they can take?
A few things come to mind. First, they can think about the biggest challenges facing their community or country. Could UBI play a role in addressing those challenges? Second, they can consider the potential economic and social impacts, both positive and negative. What are the trade-offs involved? Third, they can reflect on the values and priorities that should be guiding our decisions about UBI. What kind of society are we striving to build? And finally, think about how they can get involved in the conversation, how they can contribute to shaping the future of this whole debate.
Those are some really solid suggestions. It's all about being an engaged, informed citizen.
Absolutely. The future of UBI, and really the future of work in general, is something we'll all shape together. The more people involved in the conversation, the better equipped we'll be to make good decisions that benefit everyone.
I love that. It's a good reminder that we all have a part to play in creating the future we want.
Another thing I'd encourage your listeners to think about is the ethical dimensions of UBI. What does it mean to live in a society that guarantees a basic income for everyone? What does it mean for things like individual freedom and responsibility? How might it affect our sense of community and our shared goals as a society?
Whoa, those are some big questions. It really highlights how UBI isn't just about economics. It touches on some really fundamental philosophical and ethical ideas.
Right. When you really get down to it, UBI is about how we decide to live together and how we create a society that's fair, just, and sustainable for everyone.
Okay, so we've explored a lot of different aspects of UBI. As we move toward wrapping up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something. It seems like the questions UBI raises are only going to become more important as AI and automation continue to change the way we work.
I think you're absolutely right about that. Technology is changing rapidly, and the nature of work is evolving along with it. We're seeing jobs disappear, the gig economy is growing, and the traditional lines between work and leisure are blurring. UBI is one possible response to these changes, but it's definitely not the only one. It's really important to think about a whole range of solutions and to have open, honest conversations about what kind of future we want to create.
So what's the next step for our listeners now that they've learned all of this about UBI? How can they take this information and apply it to their own lives and communities?
Well, the most important thing is to stay engaged. Keep learning, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going. UBI is a complex issue that's constantly evolving. There's always more to learn. Connect with organizations or initiatives in your area that are exploring UBI. Attend town hall meetings or community forums where it's being discussed. Write to your elected officials and share your thoughts. And most importantly, just stay curious.
Great advice. It's all about being an active and informed citizen.
Right. Exactly. The future of UBI and the future of work itself is something we'll all create together. The more people we have engaged in the conversation, the better our decisions will be, and the better those decisions will be for everyone.
And don't forget the power of simply talking about this with others. Share what you've learned with your friends, family, colleagues. You never know what kind of interesting ideas might come out of those conversations.
You're so right. This is a topic that we should all be discussing thoughtfully and openly. The more people involved, the better prepared we'll be to make decisions about the future of UBI and ultimately the future of our society.
So as we wrap up this exploration of universal basic income, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
As AI and automation reshape the world of work, the questions UBI raises are going to become even more pressing. We all need to grapple with those questions, consider the potential benefits and the potential risks, and engage in a thoughtful discussion about the kind of future we're striving to build.
Going through all this research, it feels like this deep dive has really opened up a whole bunch of questions about the future of work and what role the government should play.
Yeah, it's definitely sparked a lot of debate, and for good reason, too. I mean, we're talking about potentially changing some really fundamental parts of society.
One thing that struck me was just how many different opinions there are on UBI. We saw economists, policymakers, social scientists, even philosophers weighing in. It seems like everyone's got an opinion.
I think that's part of what makes it so interesting. It's not just an economics question. It's social, political, ethical. We need to look at it from all angles.
You mentioned earlier that some people see UBI as a threat to, like, traditional values of hard work and self-reliance. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Some critics of UBI are worried it could create a situation where people become dependent on government handouts instead of taking responsibility for their own lives.
I can see that.
They think it might discourage people from working and take away that feeling of accomplishment you get from earning a living.
Those are some valid points. We have to consider the potential downsides, the unintended consequences, anytime we talk about big policy changes.
Absolutely. It reminds us that we need to be realistic about how people behave and how complex social systems really are. There are no easy answers.
But at the same time, it's hard to ignore the fact that the systems we have now aren't really solving problems like poverty, inequality, and the fact that jobs are less secure now with automation. Maybe UBI could help create a fairer society.
A lot of UBI supporters believe that. They see it as a way to create a more level playing field so everyone has some basic economic security, no matter what their background is or what happens in the job market.
It feels like we're at a crossroads trying to figure out what kind of future we want to build.
I think that's a great way to put it. The choices we make about UBI and other policies will have a huge impact on what society looks like in the years to come.
So for our listeners who've been with us through this deep dive, what's the next step? How can they use this knowledge to make a difference where they live?
Well, the most important thing is to stay involved. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep talking about it. UBI is complex, it's always changing, and there's always more to learn. Maybe find local groups or initiatives that are exploring UBI in your area.
Yeah, good idea.
See if there are town hall meetings or community forums where you can talk about it. You could write to your elected officials and share your thoughts. And maybe most importantly, stay curious.
I like that. So being an active and informed citizen.
Exactly. The future of UBI and really the future of work itself is something we're all going to create together. The more people we have engaged in the conversation, the better choices we'll make. Choices that are good for everyone.
That's a powerful message. And don't forget, just talking about this with others is important. Share what you've learned with your friends, family, coworkers. You never know what kind of interesting ideas might come up in those conversations.
You're absolutely right. This is definitely something we should all be discussing openly and thoughtfully. The more people we have thinking about it, the better prepared we'll be to make good decisions about UBI and what kind of society we want to build.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into universal basic income, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
As AI and automation continue to change the world, the questions UBI raises are only going to become more important. We all need to think about those questions, about the good and the bad that could come from it, and have a real discussion about the kind of future we want to create.
It's definitely a future worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.